For many decades, France was like the big brother in the Sahel, controlling much of what happened there because these countries were once French colonies. But recently, France has been leaving, and China, the quiet observer, has been stepping in, bringing gifts of weapons, military equipment, and promises of protection and friendship, just like the three wise men brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh to visit baby Jesus. But this time there are three babies: Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. But why is China suddenly so interested in this dusty, troubled region of Africa? What does China hope to gain? And how are these changes reshaping one of the world's most strategically important, yet vulnerable regions? The answers might surprise you, and they tell us a lot about how power is shifting in our world today. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating story, let's understand where it's taking place. Picture this. The Sahel is a giant belt of semi-desert land that stretches across Africa, just south of the mighty Sahara Desert. Think of it as a transition zone, not quite desert, not quite grassland, spanning countries like Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. This region has always been challenging to live in. The land is dry, rainfall is unpredictable, and farming is difficult. Yet millions of people call it home, with rich cultures and histories dating back thousands of years. In recent years, this region has faced growing problems: climate change making farming even harder, terrorist groups causing mayhem, and weak governments unable to provide basic services to their people. But beneath this difficult landscape lies treasure. Niger has some of the world's best uranium, the stuff used to make nuclear power. Mali has gold and potentially valuable lithium for batteries. Burkina Faso has gold and other minerals. These resources have long attracted outside powers, particularly France, which used uranium from Niger to power its nuclear plants back home. So why is China now stepping into this complicated picture? And what does France's exit mean for the people who live there? Let's take a journey through time to understand how we got here. Ever since the late 1800s, France controlled these lands as colonies, taking resources and setting up systems that benefited French interests. When these countries gained independence in the 1960s, France didn't completely leave. It kept military bases, special economic deals, and strong influence over the governments. Many people in these countries started feeling like France was still acting like a colonial power, even though on paper they were free. France said it was staying to help fight terrorism and bring stability. In 2014, it launched a big military operation called Operation Barkhane, sending thousands of French soldiers to fight against terrorist groups in the region. But as years passed, terrorist attacks didn't stop. In fact, they got worse in many places. Why are French soldiers still here if they're not making things better? Many local people began to ask, are they really here to protect us, or to protect France's access to our resources? These questions grew louder and louder. In Mali, military officers took over the government in 2020 and again in 2021. In Burkina Faso, military leaders seized power in 2022. In Niger, soldiers overthrew the government in 2023. All these new military governments had something in common. They wanted France to leave, and leave France did. First from Mali, then Burkina Faso, and finally Niger. French soldiers packed up their equipment, closed their bases, and flew home. For the first time in over a century, French military power was no longer directly present in much of the Sahel. This created a vacuum, an empty space where French power used to be. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does international politics. Someone was bound to fill that empty space. But who? While France was struggling with its deteriorating relationships in the Sahel, another country had been quietly building connections across Africa: China. China's approach was different. Instead of sending soldiers, China sent construction workers to build roads, bridges, and buildings. Instead of military bases, China built hospitals and stadiums. While Western countries often attached political conditions to their aid, China simply said, "We won't interfere in your internal affairs. Let's just do business." This approach won China many friends across Africa, but for a long time China kept a lower profile in the Sahel specifically. The region was seen as France's backyard, and China didn't want to step on French toes. China focused more on eastern and southern Africa, where rich deposits of minerals could feed China's hungry industries. But as France began withdrawing from the Sahel, China saw an opportunity. Here was a region with valuable resources: uranium in Niger, gold in Mali, potential lithium deposits across the region, suddenly open for deeper engagement. More importantly, China had already invested billions of dollars in these countries. The China National Petroleum Corporation had spent over $4 billion developing oil fields in Niger and building a 2,000-kilometre pipeline to take that oil to the coast. Chinese companies were mining gold in Mali and Burkina Faso. Chinese construction firms were building government buildings, roads, and other infrastructure projects. These investments needed protection. With France leaving, who would ensure these projects remained safe from terrorist attacks or political instability? China decided it would have to play a more active role in security. But how could it do this without repeating what many saw as France's mistakes? How could China protect its interests without appearing like a new colonial power? The answer came in the form of a carefully calibrated strategy that mixed military assistance with economic partnerships, a strategy that's reshaping the Sahel today. In January 2023, a shipment arrived in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Inside were brand new armoured vehicles manufactured by Norinco, China's largest weapons manufacturer. This wasn't just any weapons delivery, it was a statement. While Western countries had been reducing military support to Burkina Faso's new military government, China was stepping up. More shipments followed, including VN-22 armoured vehicles designed to withstand the kinds of roadside bombs frequently used by terrorist groups in the region. Around the same time, Norinco opened a sales office in neighbouring Senegal. It wasn't just looking to make a few weapons sales, it was planning a long-term presence in West Africa's military market. In Mali, another country where soldiers had taken power and pushed French forces out, China signed a deal to provide military equipment, training, and even technology transfer. This meant Mali wouldn't just get Chinese weapons, it would start learning how to make some military equipment itself. Most recently, China appointed its first ever defence attaché to Niger, a military diplomat whose job is to strengthen ties between the Chinese and Nigerian armed forces. At the ceremony introducing Colonel Major Chen Shuming, the Chinese ambassador promised China would support Niger in strengthening its security capabilities and in the fight against terrorism. What makes China's approach different from France's? For one thing, China isn't sending its own soldiers to fight. There are no Chinese military bases in the Sahel, no Chinese combat troops patrolling the desert. Instead, China is providing the tools and knowledge for local forces to fight their own battles. Secondly, China doesn't publicly criticize how these governments are run. When soldiers took over in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Western countries condemned the coups and cut aid. China simply continued business as usual, treating the new military rulers as legitimate partners. But is China's growing military influence in the Sahel purely about selling weapons? Or is there a deeper strategy at play? To understand that, we need to look at what China really wants in Africa, and what might stand in its way. When China looks at the Sahel, it sees much more than a market for weapons. It sees critical pieces in a much larger puzzle, China's long-term strategy for global influence. First, there are the resources. Niger has high-grade uranium ore that accounts for about 5% of the world's uranium mining output. For decades, this uranium helped power France's nuclear plants. Now China, which is building more nuclear power plants than any other country, wants to secure that supply for itself. Niger also has oil, which Chinese companies have been developing since 2008. The $4+ billion that China has invested in Niger's oil industry isn't just about the oil itself. It's part of China's strategy to diversify its energy sources so it's not too dependent on any one region. Then there's Mali, which has significant gold reserves and potentially valuable lithium deposits. Lithium is crucial for making batteries for electric vehicles and electronics, industries where China is a world leader. Securing access to lithium sources around the world is a top priority for Beijing. Beyond resources, the Sahel offers China strategic transportation routes. That 2,000-kilometre pipeline carrying Nigerian oil to the Atlantic Ocean is just one example. China has also been building and upgrading roads, railways and ports across Africa as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, a massive plan to create trade routes connecting China with Europe, Africa and beyond. But perhaps most valuable of all are the relationships China is building. Every time China steps in with military equipment when Western countries step back, it gains goodwill from local governments. Every time China builds infrastructure without lecturing about democracy or human rights, it strengthens its image as a different kind of partner, one that respects African sovereignty. These relationships translate into votes at the United Nations, support for Chinese positions in international forums, and a growing global network of countries that see their future more aligned with Beijing than with traditional Western powers. But China's growing influence in the Sahel hasn't gone unchallenged. Other powers have their own interests in the region and their own strategies for maintaining influence. Russia has also been expanding its presence, often in ways that complement and sometimes compete with Chinese interests. When Mali's military government pushed French forces out in 2022, it didn't just turn to China for help. It also invited the Wagner Group, a Russian private military company with close ties to the Kremlin, to help fight terrorist groups. Hundreds of Russian mercenaries arrived, bringing with them combat experience from Syria, Libya, and Ukraine. Unlike China, which provides equipment but not fighters, the Wagner Group puts boots on the ground. Its mercenaries join Malian forces in combat operations against jihadist groups. This gives Russia a more direct role in shaping security in the region. But Russia's approach comes with costs. Wagner Group operations have been linked to human rights abuses in Mali and elsewhere. And unlike China's state-owned companies, which can take a long-term view, Wagner has faced pressure to show quick results and secure access to resources to pay for its operations. After the death of Wagner founder Yevgeny Prigozhin in 2023, questions arose about the future of the group's African operations. Russia has moved to bring Wagner more directly under state control, suggesting that it still values these operations as part of its broader strategy in Africa. For China, Russia's presence in the Sahel presents both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, Russian and Chinese interests sometimes overlap. Both want to reduce Western influence in Africa. Both benefit from good relations with governments that feel alienated from the West. And in many cases, they can divide responsibilities, Russia providing combat forces while China supplies equipment and builds infrastructure. On the other hand, Russia's more aggressive approach and the controversies surrounding Wagner operations could complicate China's carefully cultivated image as a benign partner focused on development and mutual benefit. So how do China and Russia navigate their sometimes competing interests in the Sahel? And where does this leave the United States and other Western powers that have their own concerns about security in the region? The changes happening in the Sahel aren't just about China replacing France. They're part of a much bigger shift in how power works in our world. The United States, for example, has been very concerned about terrorism in the Sahel. It built a $400 million drone base in Niger to help track and target terrorist groups. After Niger's military takeover in 2023, relationships became strained. The US has had to reduce its operations there, but hasn't completely left. European countries beyond France also have interests in the region. Germany, Italy, and others have participated in military and development missions. The European Union has spent billions on aid programs. But like the US, these countries face challenges working with the new military governments. For the military rulers in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, this complex landscape offers both risks and opportunities. By playing different outside powers against each other, they can gain leverage and resources. If the West won't help us fight terrorists without political conditions, They effectively say, we'll turn to China and Russia instead. This strategy has worked to some extent. While formal Western aid has decreased, China has increased its support. Russian Wagner forces provide combat assistance that Western countries wouldn't offer without strict oversight. The military governments have managed to stay in power despite international pressure. But this balancing act carries dangers too. Relying too heavily on any one foreign power, whether China, Russia, or another, could lead to new forms of dependency. And the fundamental problems facing the Sahel, climate change, poverty, weak institutions, and violent extremism, can't be solved by switching from one foreign patron to another. So where does this leave the people of the Sahel, who have seen armies come and go, governments rise and fall, but whose daily struggles continue, regardless of who claims to be helping them? Underneath all the geopolitical chess moves, the people of the Sahel continue to face immense challenges. Over 6.5 million people have been displaced by violence in the central Sahel region. Thousands of schools have closed because of security threats. Hunger is a daily reality for millions. For many ordinary citizens, questions about whether China, Russia, France, or the US has more influence might seem academic compared to more immediate concerns. Will my children be safe walking to school? Can I farm my land without being attacked? Will there be enough rain this year for crops to grow? But the shifting alliances do affect everyday life. China's investments in infrastructure have created jobs and improved transportation in some areas. Roads built by Chinese companies help farmers get goods to market and make it easier for people to access healthcare. The military equipment China provides to local armed forces might help push back terrorist groups that have made life unbearable in many communities. If these weapons help establish security, children might return to school and displaced families to their homes. At the same time, there are legitimate questions about what China's growing influence means for governance, human rights, and the environment. Unlike Western donors, China doesn't push for democratic reforms or stronger environmental protections. This hands-off approach pleases many government officials, but concerns civil society groups working for change. Similar questions apply to Russia's role. Wagner mercenaries have helped Mali's government reclaim territory from jihadist groups, potentially making some areas safer for civilians. But human rights groups have documented serious abuses during these operations, including the massacre of hundreds of civilians in the town of Mora in 2022. For the average person in Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger, the ultimate question isn't which foreign power has more influence, but whether any of them can help create conditions for peace, stability, and development. So far, decades of foreign involvement, whether French, American, Chinese, or Russian, haven't resolved the region's fundamental challenges. This raises profound questions about the future. Is there a model of international engagement that actually serves the people of the Sahel rather than outside interests? And what role should African countries themselves play in creating that model? China's expanding role in the Sahel isn't a temporary phenomenon. It's part of a long-term strategy to increase Chinese influence across Africa and beyond. So what might the future hold? In the short term, we're likely to see more Chinese military equipment flowing to Sahelian armies, more Chinese companies winning construction contracts, and more diplomatic engagement between Beijing and the capitals of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. China has appointed its first defense attaché to Niger, signalling its intention to deepen military ties. Chinese companies are looking for new opportunities in mining, agriculture, and infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative continues to expand across Africa, with the Sahel playing an increasingly important role. For African countries, China's growing role offers both opportunities and challenges. The competition between China, Russia, and Western powers gives African governments more options and potentially more leverage to pursue their own interests. But it also risks turning the Sahel into a battleground for influence, where local needs are secondary to geopolitical calculations. The story of China's growing influence in the Sahel is still being written. What began as a cautious economic presence has evolved into a multifaceted engagement that spans military cooperation, resource development, infrastructure construction, and diplomatic support. As France's long shadow recedes from the region, China has stepped forward, not with dramatic gestures or declarations, but with steady, pragmatic engagement that aligns with its global strategy of building influence through economic ties and political partnerships. If you felt something while watching this, pride, inspiration, hope, or maybe even a spark of possibility igniting within you, don't let that feeling fade away. Subscribe to the New Tourist channel right now. Like and share this video and turn on notifications because our next video will blow your mind.